Welcome everybody to this lecture from the Big Bold Health team. I'm Dr. Austin Perlmutter. I'm the Chief Science Officer here at Big Bold Health, and today I'm so excited to be talking about arguably the most popular topic right now in health, which is how we can live a longer, healthier life. And in particular, today we are getting into the science of nutrition for longevity. So if you followed along and attended my other webinars or watched my other webinars, you'll know that we focused on, for example, slowing aging through the microbiome, or just generally what slow aging means and the pathways within our bodies that can help slow aging. And so today we are focused fully on nutrients to promote longevity, to help to slow aging within our bodies. If you have questions, if you have comments and you're watching this live, you can put those in the Q&A section. I'll try to get to them at the end. If you're watching this after the fact, drop the comments in the YouTube or wherever you're watching this, and it's really helpful for us to see what it is that you're interested in. And obviously, if you're watching this after the fact, subscribe, like, and it helps us to know that this is the type of content that you all enjoy. Quick disclaimer here, this is not content designed to take the place of your medical care. I am not your doctor, this is not medical advice, so please just use this for informational purposes only. Now, in terms of the outline of what we're going to be discussing, I alluded to this a little bit, but I will reference this again. There's going to be a lot of information, there's going to be a lot of science. This doesn't mean you have to know it all right off the bat, and of course, you can watch this after the fact and slow it down and watch it multiple times. And there's also no tests on this. So if there are things that are outside of your knowledge base, you don't have to necessarily understand all that. I'll try to do my best to give you the gist of the most important topics as we go through this. In terms of what we're going to do in this lecture, we're going to go over the key longevity science pathways, and we'll talk about, in particular, how diet maps onto longevity. So what are the key pathways linking the food that we eat with longevity? We're also going to get into the most recent, and I'm talking about publications just in the last year, the most recent research looking at how specific foods, specific nutrients may influence longevity pathways. Now, a quick disclaimer on this, there is a lot of science out on the topic of how food influences lifespan, how foods that we eat can either for the better or for the worse influence our lifespan. And clearly I won't be able to, in the scope of a 1-hour lecture, cover all of this research. So I'm just going to highlight some of the most recent and interesting research, and then a couple of examples to give you a sense as to what type of research is coming out right now. Another thing that we're going to do in this lecture is we're going to expand the conversation beyond just individual health, meaning our human health, the health of one person matters, but it is also a reflection of larger questions as to the health of ecosystems. And if we're looking at human longevity, if we're really taking a more holistic approach, we've got to be thinking about the longevity and the health of plants, of the soil, of the larger ecosystem. So we're going to talk a little bit about the American food system in particular, but this definitely generalizes to other countries, and why some of the constraints around how food is manufactured are directly infringing on our ability to best realize longevity. Finally, we'll talk about some key takeaways, and so I promise I will leave you with, at the end of this, some of the main value propositions, hopefully, of all of this science that you can take away and use right now. One other thing I'll do, so many people sent out, actually hundreds of people sent out questions ahead of this lecture, and I'm going to try to do a little bit of analysis and answer some of those questions in this lecture. So I've included a slide where I'll address some of this. Clearly, I can't address 200 questions in this lecture, but I'll try to bring some of that up as appropriate during this conversation. So I'd like to kick us off here in this topic of longevity and nutrition with the question of, if there was a single habit upgrade that could give you 10 additional years, wouldn't you try to take advantage of this? And it just so happens that there is that one thing. And what that thing is changing your diet. Multiple studies have shown that by simply optimizing diet, we may be able to add 10 or more years to our lives. I want that to sink in for just a moment. 10 additional years. So that's a huge difference between dying earlier and living a longer, healthy life. And this has been shown in multiple studies. So here's the first one. This is a publication back in 2023, and it explicitly said what I just described, which is that life expectancy can increase by up to 10 years following sustained shifts towards healthier diets in the United Kingdom. And of course, For all of those out there in the United Kingdom, great, but this generalizes. So it's not only if you live in the UK that you're going to get these benefits. What they found in this study is that in 40-year-olds, when they sustained dietary changes from unhealthy to longevity-associated dietary patterns, we'll talk about what that actually means, that it's associated with 10.8 and 10.4-year gain in life expectancy in males and females, respectively. That is incredible. We're talking about 10 plus years of additional life expectancy when you switch to a healthier diet. The largest gains are obtained by consuming more whole grains, nuts, and fruits, and less sugar-sweetened beverages and processed meats. Now, I don't know if you've heard me speak before on a stage, on Instagram, or otherwise, but you will know that if you hear me speak, I think sugar-sweetened beverages are the single worst food for human health. They have nothing you need and everything that is most caustic to human health. Specifically, they're ultra-processed foods loaded with sugar. They have no fiber. They have no nutrients that are actually of value to us. So just put this into your mind, which is the basic idea: shifting to a healthy diet may give you 10 plus years of additional lifespan. And it's not just this study. So here's a subsequent publication, 2024, Life Expectancy Gains from Dietary Modifications, a comparative modeling study in 7 countries. So expanding this out, so it's not just the UK. What they said is for 40-year-olds, lifespan extension improved from 6.2 years for Chinese females to 9.7 years for American men with adoption of longevity-associated diet. For a longevity-associated vegan diet, improvements were 5.2 and 8.7 years, respectively. So the question you're probably asking yourself is, I do want to live extra 10 years. What do I need to do? What did they actually eat in these studies that translated into 10 additional years of lifespan? But before we get there, and I promise we will get there, we're going to go into detail on what these studies found. It's important to understand the core mechanisms of how all of this works. So a little bit of recap from previous conversations. 1, we are living longer lives in general, if you look at a multi-decade trajectory, but the quality of those years is not improving, meaning we're living longer, but we're not necessarily getting quality additional years. And the topic here is health span, not just lifespan. So it's not just the number of years that we live, it is the quality of those years. So if you look here, this is kind of looking at health span or percentage of health. If you're healthiest when you're younger, what you can see is a rapid drop off in overall health, even if we are living longer lives, that really occurs around midlife and dramatically accelerates into our later years. And our goal here is not just to live longer lives, but to live longer quality lives. Our goal is to bring up our health so that we have good health up until we die. The refocus here is in moving from simply saying we're going to live longer lives to live better and longer lives. And the key pathway that we are focused on studying at Big Bold Health, which I would highly advise that we can all take a look at, is not just increasing lifespan, but rather slowing the rate of aging of our cells. That's where the science is telling us we have the best chance at making a difference. Our overall health is a reflection of the health of each of our cells and our organs. So basically, our overall health as humans is a reflection of the individual health of our organs and the individual health of our cells. And the health of our individual cells is a function of resiliency. Are our cells resilient against the stressors that they experience? Because they are definitely going to experience stressors. You can't go through the world, go through life without taking on stressors, but it's a question of how well we weather those stressors. And lifestyle in particular, we now understand, can influence how quickly our cells age. So slowing aging may actually be the single most important topic, the single most important framework for the longevity conversation in the 21st century. If we're going to pause here for just a moment and ask, how are we doing? I know that we hear many things. We hear people are in such bad shape, people are dying too early, people's health is terrible. What are the actual data telling us? So in the United States, the average adult lives to 78 years of age, 76 for men and 81 for women. This is about 4 years shorter than the average lifespan in similar countries. So in Switzerland, for example, men live to 82 and women live to 86. And in Japan, women live to 87 years of age. These are not trivial differences when you think about how many years you might be getting had you adopted different lifestyle patterns. So, not just to live an additional 5 or 4 years, but rather quality 5 or 4 years, especially if the last 10 years of our lives in the United States are of low quality because of health constraints. So, why are people in the United States dying early? And I know some of you are coming from other countries and you probably have opinions on this. Some of these things are going to be based on what you read in the news or hear in the news, but here's what the data would suggest. The top killer in the United States and around the world is heart disease. So if you look at Switzerland, which we just said as a good comparison because people live longer in Switzerland, people die more of heart disease in the United States than they do in Switzerland. So 161.5 deaths per 100,000 versus 104.5 per 100,000 in Switzerland. But when we look at gun violence in the United States, we have 4.4 people killed per 100,000 people versus 0.14 in Switzerland. Car accidents is 13 in the US versus 2.76. And air pollution, we have 4.2 thousand deaths, 4.2 deaths per 100,000 people, 14.2 versus zero point 0.4 deaths per 100,000 people in Switzerland. Why does all of this matter? It's because these environmental and social factors really do make a difference. It is not simply that is a deficiency in a single nutrient that is going to bridge this gap. However, food is an incredibly important lever that we absolutely need to pull if our goal is to live longer and maybe even more importantly, higher quality lives. So if we think about this question of what are actually the biggest levers or drivers of aging, we talk about these hallmarks of aging. And if you look across these, so senescence of our cells, dysbiosis of the microbiome, inflammation, stem cell exhaustion, the reality is that food impacts each of these. But certain of these pathways are far more readily visible in terms of how they're being affected by diet than others. So, how does diet influence longevity? Here are some of the most important of those pathways. Diet influences the microbiome, therefore influencing dysbiosis. Diet influences the immune system, therefore influencing inflammation. Diet influences epigenetics, how our genes are used. It influences cell aging. This is something called senescence, and we'll talk about that more in a moment. It changes how cells communicate with each other, and it affects proteins. So, bottom line to this is not that you memorize the slide, but to understand that there are these direct ways in which your food each day, with each bite you take, is influencing these longevity related pathways. And the bottom line is your food really does influence longevity a lot. So one of the questions that I get asked often is, okay, so you say food influences our health, but how does it actually do it? And there are so many ways in which food influences our health, both from a physical perspective in being the building blocks of our body, from the energetic perspective, metabolism and influencing energy currency in our body, but also by interfacing with various receptors. So food interfaces with your gut, changes the way that these receptors work, sends signals through your gut cells, influences the microbiome, it changes the immune system within your gut. You obviously don't have to know all of these things, but what you do need to know is that this idea that food is simply calories and that's the only reason it matters for longevity is so outdated when we recognize the extent of the different pathways linking the food that we eat with longevity and our health. Now, if we ask, what is in our food that is carrying these signals? What in the food that you eat is so important in terms of influencing longevity? It's key to understand that this is a two-sided coin, or basically food influences our health and longevity in both positive and negative ways. So fats, we think about omega-3 fats as being incredibly beneficial to overall wellness and to promoting longevity, whereas trans fats, because they are highly pro-inflammatory, appear to have the exact opposite effect. Uh, Interestingly, we're really starting to go beyond just fats, carbs, proteins, even vitamins and minerals to extend our understanding into these other parts of our diet that influence longevity and our health. And so phytochemicals or polyphenols we're now recognizing are a key piece of this puzzle. These are thousands of molecules found in plants that we've historically thought about as throwaway, meaning they don't matter that much. And yet they tend to be far, far more valuable And we've actually just published research on this topic in terms of influencing the longevity related pathways, immune and metabolic related pathways. And then finally, microbes. So if you attended my lecture on the microbiome and how the microbiome of the gut in particular influences longevity, you'll know that the microbiome matters. But as it relates to our food, what we're now learning about, and what I'll talk about in a moment, is that the microbes are on our foods. So it's not just taking a probiotic supplement, but rather different foods, especially foods that are farmed in more kind of regenerative, organic ways, may have beneficial microbes living on those foods that we consume that are populating our gut microbiome population and thereby influencing longevity. Okay, so how big of a deal does diet actually make when it relates to a number of different variables across a number of different populations? This is a study just going back here. This is a 2017 study that was then published, or a 2017 review that was then published in The Lancet in 2019. And they looked at 195 different countries, and they said that diet basically contributed to 11 million deaths or 255 million disability adjusted life years. And that would mean that 22% of all adult deaths and 15% of disability adjusted life years are due to unhealthy diet. So we're going to come back here now to where we started, which was to unpack these studies, looking at how diet, what specific parts of our diet can translate into longevity. So what foods influence longevity? And this is a publication that came out in 2023 where they talked a little bit about the specifics of what a diet for longevity looked like. And they emphasize this point, which is looking at these kind of traditional, perhaps blue zones you might have heard of, associated diets like the Mediterranean, the Nordic diet, the Okinawan diet, as well as other diets like the DASH diet, which is basically a Mediterranean diet combined with a low sodium diet, and looked at what we could be doing to understand which diets in particular mapped onto less dying early. And they found that all of these types of diets did map onto longevity. And what they talk about here are some unifying themes. These are diets that are rich in nutrient-dense plant foods. They're limited in red and processed meats. They're high in culinary herbs and spices, and they embrace distinct elements from different cultures. Now, I think that's a really interesting point. We don't often get into this, but there's an idea of different diets may be good for different people depending on where they live and depending on their genetic makeup. The most important point, though, to this slide is the understanding that there are these unifying themes in diets that are associated with longevity, and they really center around eating less processed foods. So with this in mind, let's go back to our first two studies. Remember, these two studies showed that dietary change could add 10 plus years to your life, or around 10 years to your life. Now, in the first one, you can see in this table here, this was the United Kingdom study. They showed that life expectancy can increase by up to 10 years following sustained shifts towards healthier diets. What you can see here is basically in the green and the blue, these are benefits. In the red, that is more of a downside. So what you can see is that certain things that were consumed more in the highest quintile, or the highest basically section of the population, were associated with longer life. And so here we would say that people who ate the most whole grains had an 18% benefit. People who ate the most vegetables, a 7%. People who ate the most nuts would have a 19%. And people who ate the most legumes would have a benefit of, in this case, 28%. So, meaning they were less likely to die early. Now, conversely, what you see here is people who consume the most refined grains in quartile 4 or quintile 4 were actually had a higher risk of dying early. Similarly, for processed meat and for red meat and for sugar sweetened beverages, which of all of the risk factors was the highest. So the people who were in the top tier in terms of consumption of sugar sweetened beverages were at the highest risk of dying early. When we compare this to the other study, so they looked at kind of what a optimized or an optimized vegan approach would look like in terms of promoting longevity. And so they kind of go through and say, Here is what the makeup would look like for a longevity optimized diet and for a longevity optimized vegan diet. What you can see here are a couple of differences. So in an optimized vegan diet, you're consuming more grams a day of vegetables compared to an optimized overall diet, which is 400 grams as opposed to 600 in the optimized vegan group. But some of the interesting things here would be in the longevity optimized diet, there's a consumption of fish, whereas in the vegan diet, no surprise, no fish. Similarly, you can see here that there is milk consumption or dairy consumption in the optimized diet, but not in the optimized vegan diet. Now, we'll talk about this more in a moment, and I'm sure that people have questions about this. But if we're talking about what is the specific dietary pattern that is most associated with longevity, is it a vegan diet? The answer is no. So there is more data to support a omnivorous diet for longevity than a vegan diet. And this doesn't mean to say, or it doesn't mean that you can't be a vegan and be super healthy and live a long life, but here are some of the potential considerations. So the optimized diet from this study, you may recall, people live longer than in the people who were doing the optimized vegan diet. People who were in the vegan diet did not consume fish. Why does that matter? Fish are specifically certain types of fish are the best sources of omega-3 fatty acids, which are correlated with improvements in immune system function and longevity, especially brain longevity. Dairy, we can debate what dairy actually means, the differences in different types of dairy, but there are some important proteins in dairy. Casein, whey, it also contains minerals, and depending on the yogurt that you consume or the dairy that you consume, can contain probiotics. Eggs are a rich source of choline, vitamins, and protein, and I know there is a perennial debate over whether eggs are good or bad for us. But the point I'll make one more time is that if you were to just objectively look at the data to date, the best diets for especially brain health, where I spend a lot of my time, and also for longevity, it is a diet that is rich in plants, but it is not necessarily a vegan diet. So this is not me saying you can't be vegan. It is saying that if your goal is to promote longevity and you choose to be vegan, you need to be a little bit cautious as to what are some of the nutrients that you might need to supplement or otherwise get from other sources. Okay, so here's one more study I'll talk about here, which is the impact of healthy lifestyle factors on life expectancies in the US population. They here looked at lifestyle as a whole, so not just diet, but lifestyle overall. And so they followed 123,000 people for 34 years. And what they found is that 5 lifestyle variables were predictive of lifespan. So these included having a healthy BMI, and we know that the body mass index is not a perfect metric at all, but this is one of the things that they found in their study. They also found that greater than 30 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity a day was a healthy lifestyle variable. They found that moderate alcohol, we can talk more about this. They happened to find it in their study. I wouldn't necessarily say that you should start drinking alcohol. I wouldn't say anything about what you should do for alcohol, really, except for generally speaking, if you don't drink alcohol, it does not seem like it is a good idea for anyone to start for health benefits. And people who drink a lot of alcohol are absolutely at risk of a number of health issues. But they also found that a healthy diet here was one of their variables. And so just to give you context here, they found that for people who engaged in the 5 unhealthy behaviors compared to people who engaged in the 5 healthy behaviors, so exercised, maintained a healthy BMI, ate real minimally processed food, that the difference was absolutely incredible. So people who followed a healthy lifestyle had a boost to their age of 14 more years after age 50 if you were a female, and 12.2 years after age 50 if you were a male. There's 2 things I want to highlight here. One is look at how substantial the actual numbers are for people who do generally healthy stuff. So if you are a woman and you do unhealthy stuff, you would generally expect to die around age 79. If you do healthy things most of the time, you might live to 93 years or later on average. That is exceptional. But the other thing I want to highlight here is when you look at the extent of lifespan prolongation from doing all of these things, the exercise, the weight, and granted some of these are related to each other, you're really not seeing a huge difference over some of the benefits we already saw with just diet. So if diet gives you 10 years, you might get an additional couple years from doing these additional things. So not to say that exercise doesn't matter, not to say that working on these other variables doesn't matter, but diet is a cornerstone. Now, I want to transition here a little bit because it's easy to get to the point of saying, well, it's just about eating unprocessed or minimally processed foods. Make sure you're getting enough of your antioxidants, enough of your fats, carbs, and proteins. But one of the domains that we are spending a lot of time thinking about at Big Bold Health, and I hope that you're interested in as well, is that there's more to food than simply the basics, the calories, the fats, carbs, and the proteins. And so on a given food, you also have microbes. These are soil microbes usually, but they can come from other places. There can be residues from pesticides if those are used. There are these polyphenols, these plant nutrients that are what give, for example, a carrot its color, but also that influence our immune system, our metabolism, our microbiome, and therefore influence our longevity. Micronutrients, so vitamins and minerals, and then macronutrients. You've heard of the macronutrients, you've heard of the micronutrients, but you may not have heard as much about these others. And if you're here, if you're listening in, again, I know you're coming from all sorts of countries all around the world. Chances are, I would argue, that you're already taking certain steps to improve your diet. You're probably not eating a standard diet. And if you are, that's fine too, because it creates a lot of opportunity to improve your dietary quality. But when we look at what is happening in the US, which is really happening now around the world, we see that the vast majority of what we consume from a caloric perspective, from a general food perspective, is coming from junk ultra processed food. So in the United States, 67% of calories in adolescents and children come from ultra processed foods. And in adults, that's 57%. Beyond this, most of the calories that we consume in the US and around the world come from just a few different crops. So, looking here at United States, what you can see is 65% of harvested cropland is coming from just a couple of things. So that's corn, we have soybeans, we've got wheat, and then really after that it drops off pretty considerably. If we put this into the larger context of what we're saying here, in terms of people are eating more and more ultra processed food, and it's coming from just a couple of sources, we think about the global population. So right now we're a bit over 7 billion. I don't think we're quite at 8 billion yet. We're supposed to hit 9 billion by 2050. We know that food demand will need to increase by up to 100% by 2050. And we know that we're losing, about 16% of our plants to pathogens. Thinking about this, we absolutely have to keep in mind that we need to increase nutrients, not just calories, but also protect the quality of our land to continue to produce healthy crops. So higher plant diversity encourages and decreases, I should say, the impact of pests and plant diseases. This isn't trying to make a political statement. It is simply saying that as we look at the global need for, yes, calories, but also for nutrition, that we have to be looking at what we're currently doing and asking whether that is something that sustains the longevity of the population. The other piece of this, which is so fascinating, is we've got 20,000 species of edible plants around the world, but 90% of our calories come from 15 of these species. So what this means to me is many things. But again, putting this into the context of human longevity, we have to build resilient ecosystems that can produce enough of the nutrients, not just the calories, but also the other nutrients that we know we need, including polyphenols, vitamins, and minerals. And that means we have to take a very careful look at what we are doing in terms of what we are growing. Now, this science that I'm going to present to you here is very recent in terms of it being known, but it's still very early, and I would say most people don't even know about this in terms of implementation. So this is research that was published in 2021 in Nature Scientific Reports. And what they found here when they looked at foods and they analyzed the actual food, the vegetables, the fruits, that there is an entire microbiome that lives on our food. So here they looked at olives and figs and spinach, and you can see, just like what you would see in a human gut microbiome, that there are these very differentiated microbiomes of the food that we eat. Why does this bring up any level of interest for me? It's because it is so easy to kind of fall victim to this reductionist approach to say, well, if we get enough calories, then we're covered. But if you eat too many calories, you will, statistically speaking, die early. So it isn't just about having enough calories available. Similarly, when we think about what else is in our food, we now understand you need adequate micronutrients, vitamins, and minerals. So it's not just about getting enough calories, it's about the micronutrients and the specifically vitamins and minerals. Take that one step further, the polyphenols, these nutrients that are really only made by plants in response to environmental pressures. And then finally, the microbiome, which is a reflection of the soil. All of these different microbes that we are consuming that are influencing our physiology. So the bottom line to all of this is longevity in humans as it relates to our diet is bigger than just eating the right calorie amount and even the right vitamins and minerals and macronutrients. Okay, so let's bring this together here before we jump into the science. What types of dietary patterns most support longevity? I think about some of these key pathways. So we definitely want to support a healthy microbiome. What does that look like? A diversity of plant-based foods, organic food if feasible. Different people have different opinions on this. I am not some sort of incredibly concrete person on this where I'd say it has to be organic. Absolutely. For many people, it's not cost effective or not feasible for them to purchase organic all the time. I certainly don't eat everything organic all the time, but I do when I can. And I think as it relates to what we can do to support the microbiome, there is some study or is some research suggesting that organic may be better if possible. But this does not mean that you have to eat organic all the time. I think that there are some helpful ways of looking at various recommendations in terms of which fruits, which vegetables, which other foods are best situated to be organic if you can afford it. Prebiotic fiber and polyphenols. So in order to support a healthy gut, we need to provide the gut with fuel so that the microbiome can eat the right form of prebiotic fiber and polyphenols so that it can support the healthy makeup of the gut microbiome. Both fiber, prebiotic fiber in particular, which is fiber that's good for the microbiome, and polyphenols support a healthy microbiome. When it comes to the immune system, this is clearly our major area of interest at Big Bold Health. We talk a lot about rejuvenating the immune system or immunorejuvenation. What are the nutrients that we think are most associated with rejuvenating the immune system? You want to be consuming your omega-3s, you want to be consuming polyphenols, and then you want to make sure to also optimize towards fiber and micronutrients. So we're talking getting adequate vitamins and minerals, meaning eating foods that have a lot of nutrients, so nutrient-dense foods, as opposed to foods like, for example, a loaf of white bread that has been largely stripped of these key nutrients. And then finally, cellular cleanup, which we'll talk about in a moment. This idea that you can reprogram your cell biology in this cleanup mechanism called going after senescence. Autophagy is also a part of this process, is something that is emerging in terms of how nutrition can be leveraged for longevity. So, deep breath here, everybody, and just a quick reset. If you're watching this live, if you have questions for me, put them in the Q&A. I know we've covered a lot of information. If you're watching this after the fact and there are things you want to comment on, feel free to drop comments on the YouTube channel or wherever you see this. And remember to like and subscribe. That's incredibly helpful to us. All right, so we're now going to get into some of the most recent science on this topic. First theme here is senolytic compounds. That is a mouthful. It's very sciencey. What does this mean? As our cells age, they can become what is called senescent. And senescent cells are also described as zombie cells. You may have heard of this before. Cells kind of go through this cycle and can get stuck in a part of the cycle where they're no longer replicating, but they're also not dead. So they're just kind of staying in stasis. This is a good idea in terms of stopping cells from reproducing that are unhealthy, but it can have these long-term effects, some of which are negative because senescent cells can produce molecules that increase inflammation and otherwise create chaos with the immune system. So this idea has been proposed, which is that we can go after and remove these senescent cells with either drugs or supplements or other interventions, which we would call senolytic. So they destroy senescent cells. There are also a category of drugs or supplements called xenomorphics. These are nutrients or drugs that disable or decrease the negative effects of senescent cells, but don't actually get rid of the senescent cell. The other thing I'll just bring up here is epigenetics. If you've heard me talk before, you probably heard me talk about epigenetics. Epigenetics is how we can program how our DNA is being used. So going back to this study that was just published in February of this year, senolytic compounds reduce epigenetic age of blood samples in vitro. Some qualifiers here. It's blood samples, it's in vitro, so it's not in vivo, meaning it's not in humans. It is outside of humans. But what they did in the cell study is they took human blood and they exposed it to these compounds. These are a host of different compounds. These are kind of like drugs, some of which are kind of coming from molecules found in nature, but these are drugs that they were able to find, were able to change these change pathways related to epigenetic age. We won't get into all the details as to what these pathways look like, but what's important about this is we are now able to see in a cell line that when we use certain compounds, certain molecules, we are able to influence cell aging by targeting these senescent cells. To take this to something that's a little bit more relevant to our conversation, this is the idea of using nutrients to do the same thing. So, not using drugs, but rather using nutrients. And so here are some nutrients that have been studied that are believed to have some of these similar effects on getting rid of these aged and otherwise unhelpful cells. So senolytics, molecules that may be able to remove senescent cells, include resveratrol, EGCG, which is a molecule that is found in green tea, and then xenomorphics, again, molecules that may be able to dismantle the negative effects of senescent cells, quercetin, fisetin, curcumin. These are molecules that are really all under the family of polyphenols. So these historically considered antioxidant molecules, we're now understanding they do so much more. This is one of the reasons we're so excited about Himalayan tartary buckwheat, because it's so rich in these molecules like quercetin that are now being shown to have these effects in terms of the aging process. Now, real briefly, a couple of the questions that I was able to review in terms of what people wanted to know for this lecture that we can get into in future sessions, but they relate to longevity and nutrition. So I always get questions on ApoE4, whether you're double homozygous or heterozygous. So you can have ApoE2, ApoE3, ApoE4. ApoE4 translates into a higher risk for certain types of conditions, specifically dementia. Um, Interestingly, it looks like ApoE4 carriers may do better with less saturated fat intake and more omega-3 intake. That's kind of getting a little bit to precision nutrition as opposed to just general nutrition. I'll also bring up here a question I had. Usually people ask me something about fasting and longevity, and I totally understand why that is interesting. When you look at animal models and you starve them perpetually or basically calorie restrict them, it does seem to improve longevity. There's some data for epigenetic age improvement, meaning slowing of aging from a cellular perspective in humans. But the concern that I have, and that I know many other researchers have, is that starving people indefinitely is not a sustainable play in terms of what people are willing to do. And it's a lot easier to starve an animal in a cage than it is to starve a human in the real world. So I am a little bit concerned about trying to generalize and saying, well, fasting long term is the solution to longevity in humans. One other thing I'll bring up here is high protein. So we are having a moment here of emphasis on high protein everything. And there are other webinars on the Big Bold Health channel, one that Jeffrey Bland did and one that I did on the topic of protein and what muscle and what all this represents. But generally speaking, high protein, especially when you consume protein from animal sources that tends to be a little bit more bioavailable, protects muscles when we couple the protein intake with especially resistance training. So if you eat more protein and you're lifting weights and you're doing exercise, you will gain muscle. Why does that matter? It's because decreased muscle mass does correlate with more frailty. And so having healthy muscle seems to be protective. And overall, this may come at the cost of certain aspects of longevity. We're seeing data now suggesting that low methionine, methionine is an amino acid, and other amino acid restriction may be of value. What I would say here is there are strong opinions on both sides. So some people would say, absolutely eat a ton of protein, build muscle. That's the only thing that matters. Then you can be strong and survive. And other people would say, hey, you don't want to be eating all this protein because actually it looks like people who eat the most protein may die early. What I will say is, as it relates to pathways behind this, I do think there is a liability in perpetually consuming a lot of protein and specifically certain amino acids because they inhibit autophagy. They activate a pathway called mTOR, the mammalian target of rapamycin, and they inhibit a pathway called AMP kinase. So for those of you who are out there who are deep in the longevity science, those words will mean something to you. What that means to me is you want to give your body the opportunity to clean up. And if you're perpetually taking in a ton of protein and taking in a bunch of calories, you're not getting that opportunity. So we can get into this more in additional lectures, but the main point I'm making here is there is still a pretty significant debate as to whether it makes sense to consume a lot of protein if your goal is to live a long life. Okay, I want to touch on a couple of other studies here real quickly that have just been published. This one I thought was interesting. Gut vitamin D interplay, key to mitigating immunosenescence and promoting healthy aging. Now, if senescence is the aging of a cell where it gets stuck in this perpetual state of not being dead, but also not being super helpful, immunosenescence is basically that around the immune system. There are a number of things you can see in a senescent immune cell or a senescent immune system, but suffice it to say, you do not want your immune system to get to a state of immunosenescence, and many of the targets that people are looking at for longevity go after immunosenescence. So in this study that was published this May, what they found is a couple things. One is vitamin D. Vitamin D, you all know, is a vitamin, but it's actually better characterized as a hormone because of how it works. That vitamin D changes the makeup of the gut microbiome, and that when gut vitamin D changes the influence to the microbiome, this then influences the immune system and immunosenescence. Beyond this, vitamin D is influenced by the gut microbiome. So when the microbiome is set up in a certain way, that impacts the way we absorb and metabolize vitamin D. And when we take in vitamin D, it influences the microbiome. I use this study as an example of showing you just how interconnected all of these things are. So our diet changes the microbiome, but the microbiome changes our diet. That the diet changes the microbiome, which changes these pathways in the immune system, which then influence overall longevity. All of this is to say the complexity of how our diet influences longevity is extreme, and it doesn't discount from the fact that a basic, minimally processed diet is essential. Now, this is one I brought in just because I thought it was interesting. I am a coffee drinker. I am a tea drinker. I don't know about you, but for those of us who consume these beverages, we're always trying to find out what exactly does the latest science say. So this is a poster presentation, not even peer reviewed, but I really just thought it was interesting, so I wanted to bring it up. Just came out last month, and they looked at the influence between midlife caffeine intake and healthy aging in women. They defined healthy aging in women as people who live to age 70 with no cognitive and physical impairment, no major chronic diseases, and they used 47,000 women with data they collected from 1984 to 2016. They looked at caffeine sources, coffee, tea, cola. They also looked at decaf coffee using these questionnaires where people, I mean, you could argue how valid these things are, but most of the time when you look at these nutritional studies, they use these food frequency questionnaires or FFQs. They found that roughly 4,000 women met criteria for healthy aging, and they found that regular coffee intake correlated with a 5% higher odds for healthy aging per cup per day. Now, what I like about this study is it wasn't just the caffeine, because soda consumers, people who drank soda, which, as I alluded to earlier, sugar sweetened beverages are the worst of the worst. But sugar consumption with soda and the caffeine consumption with soda, it kind of seemed to lead to a relative deficit in terms of the healthy aging. Now, was that because the sugar outweighed the caffeine, or was it because of something else? We don't know, but soda drinkers had worse outcomes, around 20% worse per glass of soda per day, and decaffeinated coffee and tea users did not show benefit or negative effects. So this suggests there may be something to caffeine. Now, as I said before around alcohol, I'm not trying to give you all the recommendations. I do consume caffeine each day. I think for certain people who have anxious symptoms, caffeine is something that they should be considerate of and not necessarily consume. However, the biggest variable I will bring up here is if you're going to consume caffeine, the most important thing is not to compromise your sleep. So if you're going to consume caffeine, make sure that you focus that in the first half of the day. For me, my threshold is 2 p.m. I can't do caffeine after 2 p.m. or I know my sleep gets hit. For some people, that's midday, that's noon. Maybe they're faster metabolizers. But realize here that caffeine is something we need to consider as it relates to our unique physiology. All right, let's see if we can land the plane here a little bit. Let's bring together all these topics in terms of what does longevity and nutrition, how do these things connect? How do we make sense of all this? So this is, I think, a very helpful study. It was very clearly entitled Optimal Dietary Patterns for Healthy Aging. It was published the 24th of March, 2025 in Nature Medicine, very good journal. And they looked here at adherence to different dietary patterns in healthy aging up to around 30 years. They had about 105,000 people. Of these, roughly 1/10 were considered healthy agers. And what they found is that people who consume the healthiest diets had almost a 50% higher rate of healthy aging. So, if we're going to bring this to what were the healthy foods they found in this study? Fruits, vegetables, whole grains, unsaturated fats, nuts, legumes, and low-fat dairy. What about unhealthy foods? Trans fats, high sodium intake, sugary beverages. How many times do I need to say this? Sugary beverages are the worst. And then red or processed meats. Now, I'm certain there are those out there who will say, hey, I thought red meat was actually really good for us. These studies are biased. We can get into this. I think we can all agree that processed meats are not good for us. I think we could also look into whether certain types of meat, in terms of their degree of processing, in terms of how that meat is raised, may have differential effects on our health. But it is true that when you look at some of these studies, there is a signal that higher consumption of red meat may be correlated with worse health outcomes. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. Beyond these food variables in terms of which foods, I think it's really important to recognize it's not just about the nutrients, it's not even just about what is on the food. Eating mindfully, eating in community. There is no stronger predictor of happiness than community. So eating in community, eating foods that you grew, if you can raise a garden, amazing. If you can go out and forage for your food, as I enjoy doing in the fall up here in the Pacific Northwest, and no, I will not give you my mushroom spots, but being engaged with the food, where it comes from, knowing your farmers, these things really do matter. So eating slowly, taking the time to actually eat the food, and then eating earlier in the day. We didn't get into all the details around time restricted eating and whether you should be using a certain fasting window. I've actually moved a little bit away from this idea of postponing breakfast into a later hour in the day, but I do think it is a net negative to be eating dinner late in the night. In future lectures, we can talk about what this does to your circadian biology, but I do think that we've maybe over-indexed towards late fasting in the day where some people do benefit towards eating breakfast. Okay. So to wrap this up, the genetic contribution to your lifespan is only about 20%. What does that mean? It means that the majority of the variables that will determine how long you live are not a function of your genes. They are a function of your environment, of your lifestyle, the things that you do, and the things that happen to you. That presents an incredible opportunity. If you want to, and I hope you do, live a long and healthy life, it means that the majority of whether or not that happens is not something that is predetermined by your genetics. We know that we can influence the rate of aging by targeting cell aging, by slowing cell aging. And that means that every bite that you take can be a vote for longevity and for health span. So to conclude here, first of all, I so appreciate it if you've made it to this part of the lecture. This is a lot of content. But I want to stress this point, which is that food matters so much. But we have this strong tendency to go to a reductionist take on saying, well, as long as you get this many grams of protein or this many grams of fat or this many micrograms or milligrams of a vitamin, you're good. And the reality of it is that if we were to strip away all of the things that make life complicated, so say you're just going to eat these nutrients and you're not going to worry about where that food came from, we wind up in a similar situation as we were in just a couple of decades ago, where there was this idea that there were these germs and we wanted to avoid any exposure to microbes and that we would be healthier if we could just be sterile. Now, we now recognize very clearly that this gut microbiome and the microbiome on our entire bodies is fundamental to our health. It's not just a question of saying, well, we want to get rid of all the microbes. Rather, it's a question of saying we want the microbes there, but which microbes should we bring in? And I think it's the exact same conversation we need to be having around our food. This isn't just about calories. This is about consuming food that has been raised in a way that is helpful to the soil so that we can continue to raise those healthy foods. This is about having animals, if you choose to eat animals, that are eating healthy plant-based foods, because that then translates into healthy animals. And when we consume those animals, we actually get the benefit of their diet when we consume them. This is about expanding beyond just eating a couple of crops across the entire planet, corn and soy and wheat, and talking about the importance of diversity in the food that we eat. So this is a very big conversation, but fundamentally it does come down to each day taking steps to maximize diversity of the nutrients we consume, eating a minimally processed diet, and then actually thinking about how we put that into the ecosystem of a longevity supporting lifestyle.